There were exactly hours left for the history of Havana to be split in two, and on the Malecon no one looked out at the sea. Havana, October 20th, 1926. The wind that sweeps the Malecon is no longer a Caribbean breeze. It is a heavy air loaded with the metallic smell of salt. The Florida Strait spits dense foam onto the stone wall, causing a physical vibration under the shoes of those who walk along the avenue. In full splendor of the Paris of the Caribbean, the routine remains intact. While glasses clash in the casinos and the engines of the first Cadillacs roar through the streets, the entire city ignores what is happening in the ocean. A few kilometers away, the atmospheric pressure is plummeting. A solid mass of wind, spinning at more than 200 kilometers per hour, advances in absolute silence towards the coast. This is the forensic countdown of the final hours of a metropolis that, blinded by its own wealth, was about to be razed by nature. To understand the true scale of the structural and human massacre that was about to be unleashed, it is imperative that we first dissect the social and physical anatomy of the Cuban capital at that precise temporal moment. In the autumn of 1926, Havana did not simply operate as just another port city in Latin America. It functioned as the absolute epicenter of excess, a shielded bubble of accelerated wealth in the Western Hemisphere. With the 18th Amendment, the famous Prohibition Act kidnapping and criminalizing nightlife within the United States, the entire island had mutated into a gigantic and magnetic magnet. It attracted fast money, crime syndicates in full expansion, high-class tourists, and oil magnates who sought refuge in an oasis where tobacco smoke was dense. The roulette wheels turned without rest, and legal limits vanished quickly with a thick wad of bills on the table. Upon entering these streets, in the hours prior to the climatic impact, the tactile sensation is one of a total and absolute disconnection with the reality of the natural world. The entire city breathes, exhales, and projects a dangerous and false illusion of invulnerability under the stinging tropical sun. The main avenues are flanked by imposing buildings of heavy stonework, neoclassical facades with thick carved columns, and hand-forged iron balconies. They look like fortresses designed geometrically to last 1,000 years without suffering a single scratch. The transport system is a living artery. The heavy electric trams cross the center of the city, spitting yellow sparks onto the copper cable network, while international visitors walk around in impeccable white linen suits and straw hats, completely oblivious to the abyss that is brewing a few nautical miles from the coast. But entering this specific strip of time, right at the threshold where atmospheric pressure begins to plummet sharply on the barometers, is equivalent to observing a massive tragedy unfolding in slow motion. From this moment on, we are going to completely abandon the superficial and sugar-coated vision of tourism pamphlets. We will immerse ourselves in the brutal, raw, and classist contrast of the Habanera infrastructure. We will analyze millimeter by millimeter the stone barrier of the great luxury hotels, designed as waterproof bunkers for the upper class, against the extreme and terrifying fragility of the suburbs on the periphery, neighborhoods crowded with working-class families living in worn-out adobe colonial houses or in precarious structures of wooden slats and rusted zinc roofs that in a matter of minutes would become flying blades. Feel the claustrophobic change in air density. Listen to the initial creaking of the wood under static pressure. At that height, the sea was already changing the behavior of the city, and Havana is about to discover in the most visceral way possible that all its economic capital and its imposing architectural beauty are worth absolutely nothing when nature presents its invoice and decides to reclaim dry land. To dissect the level of shock and devastation that was about to hit the island, we must first walk through the nerve center of Havana. During the first hours of that fateful October morning, the city dawned operating at maximum capacity, functioning like a high-precision Swiss watch, greased by the inexhaustible flow of United States dollars and British pounds. If you stand in the center of the Paseo del Prado, the sensory assault is immediate and reflects aggressive prosperity. The air vibrates with the constant metallic screeching of the heavy electric trams of the Havana Electric Railway Company, whose solid iron wheels grind the steel rails, scattering yellowish sparks under the intense daylight, sharing the pavement. The vanguard of 1920s automotive engineering parades in an obscene display of wealth, brand new cars, robust Ford, Cadillac, and Packard models, with their shiny black steel chassis and nickel-plated radiators roar through the avenues burning raw gasoline. That smell of incipient combustion mixes in the hot air with the thick smoke of whole-leaf cigars twisted by hand and the dense, dark, and bitter aroma of freshly brewed coffee that escapes from the huge windows of the cafes. Commercial routine is absolutely intact. The carved mahogany doors of banks, jewelry stores with beveled glass imported from Europe, and luxurious private clubs are wide open. Observe the people. Ostentation here is not just a habit, it is a social armor and a survival tactic in the market of the elites. North American tourists, sugar businessmen, and low-profile mobsters walk with arrogance wearing immaculate white linen suits, starched cotton shirts that crunch with every movement, and two-tone leather shoes polished until they reflect the sunlight. Women walk under lace parasols and light silk dresses. Afro-Cuban music with the dry beat of tensioned leather drums and the metallic cut of brass trumpets resounds in the background. No one looks up at the sky with concern. Everyone looks at the shop windows, towards luxury. Submerged in collective blindness, in lethal meteorological illiteracy, however, if we move away from the bustle of commerce and walk directly towards the city spine, the famous Malecon seawall, the cognitive dissonance between land and sea begins to become disturbing. Above, the celestial vault presents a pristine blue almost like porcelain. The tropical sun hits with relentless verticality, heating the concrete and causing the asphalt to radiate heat waves distorting the view. It is at first glance a postcard day, a peculiarly bright and warm morning, without a single threatening cloud to soil the horizon line. But below, at the exact point where the stone cuts the ocean, the physics of water is telling a story of imminent violence. The sea does not caress the Malecon, it assaults it. The deep waters of the Florida Strait have lost their traditional crystalline turquoise tone. They have an unusually dark, almost oily coloration and move with a heavy, thick, and unnatural mass. Every wave that crashes against the stone wall does not throw a simple sea breeze, but aggressive projectiles of salt water and thick chunks of dirty foam that stain the dry pavement. The most terrifying thing about this forensic scenario is the absolute ignorance. Thousands of people walk and drive just meters from this mass of enraged water and ignore it completely, trusting blindly in the stone barrier. In 1926, there are no satellite radars, no thermal images, no real-time radio alerts, nor urban evacuation plans. What no one in that whole city knows, what no banker, no musician, nor any politician perceives, is that a very few kilometers from that golden coast, atmospheric pressure is collapsing in free fall, an unprecedented barometric anomaly. A massive and invisible thermodynamic engine, it is feeding on the warm waters of the Caribbean, tightening its concentric rings and accumulating a destructive kinetic load that in a matter of a few hours will turn this untouchable paradise of linen, steel, and glass into a slaughterhouse of rubble and mud. At 2 in the afternoon, the thermal illusion breaks completely. The change is not gradual, it is a physical slap. If you are standing at an intersection in old Havana, you feel how the atmospheric pressure drops suddenly, causing that dull and uncomfortable buzzing in the ears that precedes the great ruptures of nature. The pristine blue of the Caribbean sky is devoured in a matter of 15 minutes by a dense mass of clouds of an almost black gray, the exact color of oxidized lead. These clouds do not float, they advance, crushing the city, drastically lowering the visual ceiling of the metropolis and blocking sunlight completely. The urban lighting, which moments before was blinding, goes out abruptly, plunging the boulevards into an artificial and claustrophobic gloom that forces the managers to turn on the electric lanterns in the middle of midday. The temperature suffers an unnatural collapse. The suffocating heat that bounced off the concrete is swept away and replaced by a cold air front loaded with a heavy humidity that sticks to the skin like a film of oil. The wind, which minutes before did not move a pin, suffers a radical mutation. It stops being a refreshing breeze to become an invisible and relentless predator. The sound it emits is no longer a coast whistle. It is a sustained, deep, and cavernous howl that scrapes the corners of heavy stonework buildings with a friction that freezes the blood. The emblematic royal palms, the unshakable symbol of tropical elegance on the avenues, begin to lean at physically impossible angles. Their fibrous trunks creak under extreme mechanical stress and their thick leaves are ripped out, flying at eye level as sharp and heavy projectiles. In less than half an hour, the elegant streets of Havana no longer look the same. High-crowned straw hats and fine headpieces are snatched from heads without warning. The people who until then walked with the arrogance of wealth begin to run in a stampede, no longer to take refuge from a simple downpour of rain, but because an invisible kinetic force pushes them from behind, unbalancing them and throwing them against the stone wall in the commercial sectors. Meteorological illiteracy gives way to raw, animal panic. The distant sound of jazz orchestras and the ticking of cash registers are abruptly silenced and replaced by a symphony of mechanical and raw desperation. The frantic and uncoordinated noise of hundreds of hammers hitting metal faster. Local merchants with cotton shirts soaked in cold sweat of pure terror drag heavy planks of raw wood and dismantled crates to seal the huge European glass windows in a hurry. There is no time to measure lace. There is no space for aesthetics or architectural care. They nail the wood directly onto the fine ornamental mahogany frames, desperately trying to shield their material heritage against what is already felt on the skin and in the bones, like a large-scale military siege. Every hammer blow is a race to death against the clock, while the wind begins to destroy the thick waxed canvas awnings, tearing them with the dry and deafening explosion of a galleon sail, bursting in the middle of the ocean. And then the first structural break occurs. The ocean breaks the rules of the game, the Malecon stone wall. designed by engineers as the definitive defense and the unshakable border of the city, loses the battle long before the eye of the hurricane hits dry land. The waves stop crashing head-on against the concrete to start jumping it in a sustained and violent way. The dark, heavy water loaded with corrosive sand and crushed underwater garbage begins to invade the impeccable coastal avenues in intermittent waves. The solid rubber tires of the parked vehicles skid and screech on the newly flooded asphalt, while a dense and salty foam flies through the air, blinding the drivers. The sea is no longer out there, contained in its natural basin. The Atlantic has overflowed and has begun to crawl like a liquid predator into the interior of Havana, swallowing the sidewalks, getting into the underground ventilation grates, and filtering constantly from under the heavy oak doors of the luxury hotels facing the bay. Nature has just crossed the line and there is no turning back. When the electrical network of Havana finally collapses under the mechanical stress of the storm, cutting high-voltage cables as if they were sewing threads, the entire city is suddenly plunged into the most oppressive darkness in its history. At this point in the timeline, human geography breaks brutally into two parallel realities isolated behind closed doors. The true psychological terror of facing a Category 4 hurricane is not experienced on the exposed avenues, where the impact of flying debris guarantees an instantaneous death, but in the suffocating confinement, waiting for the blow blindly. Let us begin by dissecting the false security of wealth inside the colossal luxury hotels in the center. The international high society and North American tourists entrench themselves in the immense marble lobbies. Visualize the scene with the precision of a forensic investigator. The same elite that hours before drank champagne in cut crystal glasses and bet fortunes is now sitting on the stone floor, cornered between thick neoclassical columns. The only lighting comes from the dying flicker of candles and emergency kerosene lamps, casting long, nervous shadows on the Venetian stucco walls. The heavy solid oak doors with bronze fittings are barricaded from the inside with heavy mahogany furniture, leather sofas and pool tables that the employees dragged in a panic attack. But human engineering, no matter how expensive it is, has unavoidable physical limits. The sound of the wind outside has mutated radically. It is no longer a continuous whistle, but the rhythmic, dull, and terrifying impact of a military battering ram hitting head-on against the building facade. The immense European glass windows vibrate at such a high frequency that it physically hurts the eardrums, and the ocean water pushed by the wind filters at very high pressure through the minimal cracks, soaking and ruining the expensive Persian carpets. The helplessness in those halls is total. For the first time in their lives, accumulated capital cannot buy thermal immunity or stop the physics of the atmosphere. Their money only guarantees them the privilege of waiting for death in a cage of gold and stone. If this meticulous reconstruction, without school filters and direct to the tactile anatomy of history, is making you feel the weight of reality, I ask you to take a tactical pause of just 1 second. And while the city was still trying to understand what was happening in front of the sea, take the opportunity to subscribe. Because here we continue to reconstruct moments in history that almost disappeared with time. Now, if the claustrophobia and panic are devouring the magnates in their impenetrable fortresses, cross the invisible line of the city and descend into the suburbs, to the dense tenements, citadels, and working-class neighborhoods on the outskirts of the capital. Here the suffocation is not a problem of loss of luxury. It is a question of animal survival. Thousands of families, port stevedores, and street merchants are huddled body to body in tiny rooms. They are trapped inside ancient colonial mansions with adobe walls worn out by humidity, or worse, in flimsy structures of raw pine wooden slats with rusted zinc sheet roofs. Close your eyes in your mind and focus on the wood, in the most absolute and total darkness. Psychological terror reaches levels that fracture the human mind. They cannot see the monster spinning over the island. They can only hear it dismember their world. The roof over their heads groans in structural agony. Every wrought iron nail screeches with a sharp metallic noise, while the suction force of the hurricane rips them millimeter by millimeter from the support beams. The floor of loose boards vibrates violently with every gust of more than 200 kilometers per hour, feeling under the soles of the feet as if the earth itself were convulsing. The smell of pervasive humidity, of overflowed sewers, of old dust raised by decompression, and of damp, rotting wood saturates the lungs, making every breath heavy and exhausting. Mothers and fathers cling to their children under thin dining tables or iron beds with their hands tightly squeezed over their ears to try to block the continuous and deafening roar of heavy debris. Tree branches ripped out, and sharp metal sheets flying at supersonic speeds out there, decapitating everything in their path. Humble houses are no longer a family refuge. They are a death trap about to detonate. They are trapped in a vacuum of oxygen, light, and hope, waiting in silence for the macabre lottery of aerodynamic physics to decide if their roof will be ripped towards the black sky in the next thousandth of a second, or if they will manage, by pure biological luck, to breathe until dawn. The clock advances towards the early morning and the core of the storm. The wall of the Category 4 Hurricane I makes direct and physical contact with the landmass of Havana. At this precise instant, the historical border between the Atlantic Ocean and human civilization ceases to exist. The collapse is absolute, kinetic, and deafening, the Malecon Wall. That mass of stone designed by the best engineers to contain tides and protect capital is literally swallowed by monstrous waves that easily exceed 10 meters in height. We are not talking about a gradual flood. It is an amphibious assault of incalculable brutality. The sea acts like a hydraulic ram, a solid wall of black, dense, and heavy water, loaded with abrasive sand and crushed underwater debris, that bursts against the facades of coastal buildings with the expansive force of a heavy artillery detonation. Visualize the absolute chaos in the almost total darkness of the streets. A suffocating blackness that is barely cut by the violent and continuous flashes of lightning, which act as macabre photographic flashes in those fractions of a second of bluish and electric light. The magnitude of the disaster is exposed in all its forensic rawness. The elegant avenues and polished marble promenades have transformed instantly into turbulent and destructive rivers. The water advances at a terrifying speed, ripping out the heavy wrought iron electric lanterns and bending the tram rails as if they were hot wires. The brand new Ford and Cadillac automobiles, which hours before represented the pinnacle of social status and weighed tons of cast steel, now float, crash, and spin uncontrollably like cheap tin toys. They are thrown violently by the waves against the building columns and crushed repeatedly until they are left turned into unrecognizable scrap metal, above, in the atmosphere saturated with salt water and debris. The fury of the wind exceeds 220 kilometers per hour. At that hour, the wind already made it impossible to remain on the Malecon. Social classes or architectural heritage. Centenary trees with deep roots clung to the Caribbean soil for generations are ripped out whole with their earth root balls flying through the air and thrown like gigantic spears that pierce masonry walls and destroy entire roofs. The zinc sheets of the suburbs, the heavy baked clay eyebrows, and the sharp fragments of the expensive European beveled glass become lethal shrapnel that travels at supersonic speed, decapitating marble statues and destroying any living being that dares to be out in the open. The physical, auditory, and tactile sensation at that moment is that of an isolated apocalypse, the absolute certainty that the entire island, with all its luxuries, its mahogany casinos, and its elite arrogance, is being swept off the map by a primordial force that cannot be negotiated, arrested, or bribed. After endless hours of uninterrupted mechanical, structural, and acoustic punishment, the hurricane thermal machine finally advances north, entering the Gulf, and leaves behind a trail of emptiness. But this is not the peaceful and warm silence of a typical Caribbean dawn. It is the heavy, thick, and sepulchral silence of absolute ruin as the sun begins to rise slowly on the eastern horizon, throwing a golden, raw, and unfiltered light over the Cuban capital. The visual contrast with the prosperity morning of the day before causes a paralyzing cognitive shock. The glittering Paris of the Caribbean has simply ceased to exist in its known physical form. The golden playground of the millionaires has been crushed to its foundations and vomited onto itself in a grotesque mess. Walking through the streets of the nerve center in these first hours of the day after is to enter a hostile and completely alien lunar landscape. The air no longer smells of hand-twisted cigars or freshly brewed coffee. It reeks intensely of salty mud, burst sewers, rotten damp wood, and spilled fuel seeping into the ground. The geographic disorientation of the survivors is total. Entire streets are unnavigable. Iconic monuments have been mutilated by the force of the impact. The famous Almain Monument, a symbol of historical pride and diplomatic strength, appears severely damaged and disfigured with its imposing bronze figures twisted by the wind and the heavy marble columns fractured by the constant bombardment of flying shrapnel. Public squares and central parks, formerly adorned with gardens meticulously pruned for the delight of tourists, are now impassable landfills, covered by mountains of irregular rubble, dense and impenetrable mud, and bloated carcasses of draft horses and drowned stray animals. But the forensic image that truly defies gravitational logic and fractures the minds of the residents who begin to slowly emerge from their destroyed shelters is the maritime invasion that arrived inland, in the middle of road intersections. In squares several blocks away from the original coastline lie huge merchant steel ships, heavy cargo schooners, and solid fishing barges. They are tons and tons of naval engineering that the ocean lifted in weight and deposited casually on the sidewalks and gardens of old Havana, crushing small businesses and blocking entire avenues with their rusted hulls. It is the physical and Dantesque signature of nature, a structural reminder of who has true control of the territory. While the population with torn dirty clothes and haggard faces covered in grayish dust walks dazed among the splintered remains of their lives, the city of financial excesses begins the macabre task of mathematically accounting for hundreds of lifeless bodies crushed under the rubble. Overnight, supreme luxury and human arrogance were reduced to dust and the entire metropolis woke up kneeling, bleeding over its own ruins. Upon observing this structural autopsy carefully and walking visually through the ruins of October 1926, we face an uncomfortable, raw, and visceral truth, which official history, always so concerned with public relations, rarely dares to pronounce out loud. Neither the vastest economic capital of the American continent, nor the most majestic and heavy neoclassical architecture of the Caribbean, nor the arrogance of an elite society that believed itself completely untouchable, could buy a single second of immunity against the windows that started to vibrate before the rain arrived. In a matter of a few hours, the hurricane turned off the lights of the endless party forever, silenced the Afro-Cuban music that resounded in the clandestine casinos, and completely rewrote the coastal geography and the social fabric of the Cuban capital. The physical marks of that Category 4 storm remained carved deeply like war scars on the stone walls of the surviving buildings. But even more were they engraved in fire in the collective memory and in the psychological trauma of an entire generation. The ostentatious Paris of the Caribbean was forced brutally to stop its frivolous march, to abandon its white linen suits, and to rebuild itself from scratch with bloody hand, removing its own rubble covered in salty mud and death. That October 20th demonstrated in a few hours that the storm destroyed entire neighborhoods, that the architectural beauty of a coastal metropolis and its status as an unshakable earthly paradise are not rights permanently acquired by man. They are and will always be merely a fragile, temporary, and dangerous loan, granted patiently by the earth and by the sea until the exact and unpredictable day when they decide to collect the debt with interest. And this immersive investigation has made you feel the atmospheric pressure of true history in your own lungs. If you value this forensic rigor that uncovers, without filters or softeners, the tactile details that school books omit for mere convenience, do not abandon this video without leaving your like. Share this visual and clandestine document with those who still have the naivety to believe that the Latin American past was docile or romantic. And if you are not yet part of our research team, subscribe to the channel at this precise instant. The time machine continues to operate at its maximum capacity. The historical memory archive is full of hidden tragedies and files silenced under lock and key, and we are going to continue opening them by force, one by one. Come what may, a big hug. Stay alert and see you in the next dossier of Nostalgia Latina.